Okay, I think it's probably time that we should crack on. We have an hour for today's session, which is entitled, which is part of the series that the firm is currently running, looking at M&A and conducting mergers and acquisitions in times of disruption and transformation. We're in the process of our second session in this series today, which will be looking at the rise of regulatory issues. And we have a number of experts from within the Stephenson Harwood network who I'll introduce to you very shortly. I'm delighted to be able to welcome a number of my colleagues to it. My name is Tom Platts. I'm the head of M&A for Southeast Asia for Stephenson Harwood. You know, it's being recorded. It'll be conducted under Chatham House rules. Obviously, over the last few years, and particularly recently, we've seen a significant increase in regulatory interest from government regulators and the government themselves in connection with M&A and passing M&A transactions through completion. Indeed, any investment these days, particularly in the Asia-Pacific part of the world and increasingly in UK and Europe, will be looked at to one extent or another by lawyers when conducting analysis of whether or not it will constitute a transaction which requires notification. It isn't going to be going away. The rise in regulation is increasing and will continue to do so, and it's giving a real new spin and trend to conducting M&A and considering what needs to be thought at right at the outset of transactions. And we're not just talking about the very well-known issues around merger control and antitrust, which obviously for many has been a big issue for a number of years. I think Marta, who is our head of global antitrust, will talk shortly in relation to that. But I gather now that there are 135 at least regulators on the competition and antitrust sector around the world, which need to be considered, and in most cases one would hope to be let go. But it is an issue that we need to continue to talk through. Here in Asia Pacific, we are seeing a significant number more M&A transactions, which, because of the size and because of the sector and because of the jurisdictions in which they're being conducted, are coming under increased scrutiny. This week, I'm very pleased to say that we'll be closing a very large transaction which has been published for BW Group in relation to its acquisition of a subsea cable platform in Asia Pacific and across the Pacific Ocean. That transaction has had to have at least 5 international clearances from the US, both the FCC and Team Telecom Australia through ASIC and through FIRB, and also in New Zealand through the Overseas Investment Office. That takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of forethought before entering into a transaction of this nature. We are also looking at a transaction which will be signed, which has been signed and which will be closing in due course, where the 2 counterparts in a joint venture are based out of France, Paris, and Japan, Tokyo. The assets as part of the joint venture will be in Southeast Asia and across much of Northern Asia as well. And yet China, MOFCOM competition clearance is the one area that which is being sought at the present time. So with that, let me introduce you to a number of our experts today. The first person I'd like to introduce is Marta Garcia. Marta, as I mentioned, is the head of our global antitrust team and is also taking the lead in terms of the firm's response to and advice in relation to foreign direct investment. Amongst others, she'll be joined by Will Spence, who is also looking directly at the antitrust situation and also is very clearly involved in the foreign direct investment regimes, particularly recently in relation to UK and Europe. I'm also glad to be joined by Sue Miller, who is a distinguished senior litigation partner who also in her practice spent a lot of time looking at sanctions and sanctions related work. And as you can imagine, in light of recent issues connected to Russia and the Ukraine, her practice has been extremely busy. but of course, it's not just about Russia and the Ukraine. A good number of jurisdictions, particularly in the APAC world where I'm currently based in Singapore, are also deeply affected by by sanctions regimes from around the world. Separately, I will also be joined, or we are also joined by Chris Edwards-Earle, who is a pensions expert and is going to talk to us a little bit about some of the recent UK and European legislation in relation to the powers of pensions regulators and how we've seen that as a particular area that needs to be focused on at the outset of transactions when looking at targets and bidders platforms. Finally, I'll also be joined by a partner in our financial regulatory team, William Robertson, who's recently joined the firm, but who will also be talking to us a little bit further in relation to some of the issues that he has been experiencing advising as part of our M&A practice. So if I may, I'd like to turn first to you, Marta. And I think because, as I mentioned, it has historically been, when talking about regulation and regulated issues in connection with M&A particularly, that people have thought, and sometimes not always thought so clearly, about issues connected to antitrust and EU compliance, let's say. What are your thoughts on that? With the rise in M&A activity that we've seen globally, are we seeing more deals being caught by merger control generally?
I think that's absolutely right. I think obviously, like you mentioned, we've seen a bumpy year of M&A activity last year, and I think that's set to continue. But you know, there are increasingly more jurisdictions that have mandatory merger control regimes, and so it's inevitable that a number of these very large and complex deals are getting caught by the merger control rules. I think what we have seen in particular are a large number of merger notifications being made in countries like the US, Canada, EU, COMESA even. You've got key jurisdictions even in South America, such as Brazil and Mexico, which are very active. And as you say, in Asia, a lot of very active jurisdictions like China, Australia, Singapore, Japan. So we're seeing that. And obviously, we're also seeing an increase in the type of sectors that are being caught by the merger control rules. We've seen that for life sciences, energy, and the transport sector. And surprisingly, not maybe so much for the tech sector, despite the fact that's accounted for quite a large share of completed deals, but that may well change as we find that digital sector comes under greater scrutiny as merger control rules develop there. But I think, yes, you're absolutely right, and I think that trend will be set to continue globally.
And generally speaking, Marta, in terms of the requirement to actually notify authorities, is there more of a role to push towards mandatory filings and mandatory notification, or do we still see different jurisdictions taking a different approach?
Well, I think the majority of jurisdictions now worldwide have mandatory regimes. I think I probably can count those regimes that have a voluntary notification on one hand. So unfortunately, if a deal triggers the mandatory regime, technically parties are obliged to file, and they can't close their deal until they get that clearance, saying that obviously parties, depending on their risk appetite, may not decide to file in certain jurisdictions. But I think I hope that answers your question, but I think, yes, we are seeing more mandatory regimes being triggered. And as a result, we are also seeing increased scrutiny in terms of the aspects that are being looked at on the deal front.
That's very interesting. Actually, you raise a good point I should have raised earlier when I first started. There is a Q&A function in the slides today, so please do feel free to ask any questions, and I will endeavour to raise those questions at the end of the session. This is very much intended to be an open discussion to talk through any issues that people have either experienced or are seeing, as well as trends. We'd like to hear your thoughts too. So, in terms of the other big issue that has hit the UK and Europe recently, and I think this is probably a question for both Marta and Will to a degree, we talk about the B word, Brexit. Obviously, being untangled from the EU to an extent, how's that affected us? And I know obviously the team in Paris have been extremely busy as well in terms of trying to work out how these transactions are going to work together. How are we seeing this all unfolding, and how are we working with our Paris practice to try to regulate the two different jurisdictions? Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, obviously, yes, now that the UK has left the EU, the CMA, so the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK that regulates merger control, they have gained new powers and functions. So you will find that parties now may well have to notify a deal not just to the UK Competition and Markets Authority, but also to the European Commission. So we no longer form part of this one-stop shop where if you met the merger control thresholds at the European level, you'd only need to notify the deal to the European Commission. So I think that's what parties are increasingly going to have to be aware of. In terms of how we're working generally, obviously, both teams can cover both. But I think that's the important thing really for clients to understand. And I think when you're looking at the UK CMA, parties need to really understand that as it's moved out of the EU, the CMA really wants to become a leading international competition authority. And so it has become, over the years, increasingly more interventionist and aggressive in its enforcement of deals that are caught. So just to give a few points, but obviously it has adopted a rather expansive view on jurisdiction. So under the UK rules, a deal can be caught if the parties have a combined share of 25% or more. And the CMA really has been interpreting that quite liberally, even in deals which raise hardly any UK nexus, so where the target doesn't even have turnover or any customers. And they've also been investigating a lot of deals where it's involved in acquisition of a very minor shareholding as low as 16%, which I think a lot of organisations think, well, my deal isn't going to really get caught. But I think that's something to be aware of here in the UK, and in particular also the CMA is one of the leading jurisdictions at the moment that seems to be blocking and frustrating deals up there with the US. So just another thing to bear in mind for parties doing deals in the UK.
I think that's a fascinating area to actually explore. Sadly, I don't think we've probably got enough time to look more into that, because I do think that's a particularly interesting point. One thing, Martha, well, there are two areas I would just quickly turn to that you and I have had lots of experience of together is understanding which regulators, which authorities talk to each other when looking at applications. So obviously we've done a lot recently together involving European clients, US clients, looking at acquisitions in Asia Pacific. I mentioned 135 countries that appear to have merger control authorities, or at least rules that implementing. So do they talk a lot? And that's the first question. And the second question, I know, which is one of your biggest bugbears, is at what stage when principals are looking at a transaction and what sort of information actually is required to do a desktop analysis, I suppose is the best way of putting it, of whether this is going to come up or not.
Okay, so on your first question, I think the answer is yes. The authorities around the world are increasingly talking to each other. So you're seeing a lot of these global deals being reviewed by different jurisdictions in parallel at the same time. So we've had a number of deals this year and last year. I can name a few like Cargotec, Concranes, Facebook Customer. They've all been looked at by the EU, the US, even the UK. And interestingly, actually, what you are finding is that the regulators are taking different decisions in these cases, sometimes clearing them in one jurisdiction and not in another, with conditions or without conditions, and even in some clearing it and then finding that in another jurisdiction they're blocking the deal and the deal totally falls away. So I think parties just need to be aware, yes, increasingly authorities are talking to each other, they are reviewing deals in parallel, they won't always take the same decision, which just adds to the complexity that I think deal makers need to take on board when navigating merger control at a global level. Now, in terms of your second question, what is the sort of information we're always looking for at the initial stages? We always look to the target primarily when it's a pure M&A deal, and we ask for the worldwide turnover broken down on a country-by-country basis. And hopefully we try and eliminate any merger control filings just on the basis of the turnover date of the target. But where not, we might need to ask further questions. But hopefully with that first piece of key evidence, we can get a long way in helping clients with their analysis.
And of course, the point there is that you're a London-based global antitrust lawyer, but of course you're able to work on, because you understand the nature of the different jurisdictions, work on an analysis of other jurisdictions when looking at this as well. And again, we've done this many, many times together, but I suppose it's just a useful thing to reflect.
It is.
And sorry, just in terms of the documentary issues around it and conditions, how much do we see, how many transactions have we seen where risk has been apportioned one way or the other, the sort of classic hell or high water type relationships that people put in place.
Yes, I mean,
arrangements or whatever.
I think in every deal that parties are carrying out, if they happen to trigger merger control, they need to think about including a suitable condition precedent that allocates risk between the parties. And in particular, if remedies are required, that you also risk, that risk factor is taken into account into your M&A documentation. So yes, I mean, this is very automatic now in a lot of deals which raise merger control filing requirements and need to be considered carefully.
Thank you, Martha. That's very helpful indeed. And actually, again, I did say earlier, it moved into you, Will, nicely as well, because I know you look at this issue a lot too. More recently, obviously, around the world, we've seen a very big uptick in terms of government scrutiny and regulatory scrutiny on transactions for a number of different reasons, whether that be a political reason, socio-economic reason, or whatever it may be. Deals that we've been doing in Australia or involving Australia and New Zealand, as I mentioned, comes up time and again. Even some of the less established regional countries around where I am are looking very highly at this as well. And you go to Indonesia and have the negative list, or you have the positive list, as it's now called, or vice versa. Will, sorry, in terms of what we've been seeing, what you've been advising on recently from the FDI perspective in the UK and the EU, and again with our Paris team, could you tell us a little bit about that and how that's all playing out again in transactions?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Tom. So, as you say, many jurisdictions are either introducing new FDI laws or strengthening existing ones. And I think there are two key reasons for this. One is that countries are now far more aware of and conscious of the potential national security risks that may result as a result of FDI flows across their borders. These concerns are driven largely by geopolitical factors and a change in the perception of what we might call traditional means by which a country's national security could be affected, being replaced by softer, more subtle ones, which can result chiefly as a result of FDI. So an appropriation of critical IP or technology, the ability to conduct espionage, and ability to undermine a nation's cybersecurity capabilities are among a few there. And a second factor compounding this is that many countries see the need to protect what we might call key domestic champions, so national companies and national assets that are critical to their socioeconomic development. So there's this heightened sense of protectionism that many jurisdictions are acknowledging through this process of screening M&A transactions, particularly on FDI grounds. And what we see this playing out is just an added complication for deals, particularly cross-border transactions, having to almost accommodate a dual merge control potentially and an FDI review process, which adds to the complexity the deal parties face, the challenges in their transactions from a logistical point of view, an extended time frame for completion, where these jurisdictions are often mandatory and suspensory in nature. So it can often be a headache for deal parties to deal with.
And it's interesting because this is more of a push by worldwide governments that had previously, I think it may be fair to say, had been pushed for by stakeholders and interested parties, whether they be activists or shareholders or whatever it may be, by third parties which aren't connected. So I think, for example, the powers that, for example, the takeover panel used to have in the UK. You look at, for example, the deal many years ago between Kraft and Cadbury. You look at BAA for L'Oréal. We've not talked about this previously. I'm just thinking about it as we talk. But the different areas that were sort of enforced by dint of panel type issues as opposed to government and regulatory. So how much of this are you actually seeing, Will, in practice? Because it's only recently come into force in the UK, and again in Australia only very recently, in the last 2 years, and many other jurisdictions likewise.
Yeah, so picking up on the UK point first, obviously we have a new regime under the National Security and Investment Act, which came into force here in the UK on the 4th of January this year. Currently, the regime is bedding in, and we are yet to see exact statistics and how much deals are actually being affected to the extent that they might be blocked or prohibited, for example. I think that is all will come out in due course. But what we are seeing is an uptick more broadly than the UK of deals that are being reviewed by regulators. So the number being reviewed is increasing. I think it's relevant to point out that we are not necessarily seeing a sharp uptick in the number of deals that are prohibited under FDI screening laws. And I think this will also be the case here in the UK, where BEIS, the government regulator in charge of the NSI regime, has been keen to stress that they predict a very rare number of circumstances in which they will actually block a transaction. But the important point to note is that whilst clearance will hopefully be achieved in the majority of cases, the likelihood that regulators like BEIS in the UK or others around the world of taking an active interest in transactions is much more of a risk and more likely to happen.
So let's say, for example, I've got a transaction which is purely Asia Pacific related. So it's a Singapore acquisition of an Australian real estate business. Well, let's not go sector, but there is a UK subsidiary which is set within the UK, which is a trading business of some sort. Am I worried?
I mean, yes, quite frankly, from an NSI point of view, it is perfectly possible that such a relationship could give rise to what we call a trigger event here in the UK that could give BEIS the ability to scrutinize such a transaction. One of the controversies of the NSI regime is that it has a very broad extraterritorial effect, whereby it can review transactions even which take place outside of the UK, where the parties involved have what we call a UK nexus, and this can be inferred from having an active UK subsidiary which is directly overseen by a foreign parent company. So situations like this are not exempt from scrutiny, which is often a very counterintuitive element of the new regime.
Okay, and I think, again, that's a similar sort of position from everything that we've seen and talked to our colleagues in various different parts of the world as well recently on a number of other transactions. Similar to Marta, I suppose your advice is always, when looking at the steps plan, the IM, the PowerPoint presentation or board pack, whilst I'm sure lawyers aren't always welcome in every single circumstance in the room, it's always a good idea to bear in mind that this is something that can come up, because you don't want a nasty shock towards the end of the transaction when suddenly it's all dawned upon people that there is a potential for filing in the UK, in Europe, in wherever it may be, without thinking about the wider parameters.
Absolutely right. The earlier that an FDI assessment can be conducted, the better it will be, because this can be, as you say, a very nasty shock that can arise down the line if it hasn't been considered early on. And yes, it can be a factor for parties even considering the viability of the transaction from the start. If they're considering a target, for instance, that's involved in the UK, what we call a key sector. So, for example, a nuclear defense or cybersecurity, for example. These are targets that immediately raise red flags from a regulator's point of view. So covering this off initially is very important for parties to ensure that their transactions are not going to be tripped up down the line and can be viable from the offset. So the earlier this analysis is done, the better.
And actually in practice, oh, sorry, Marta.
Sorry, and just to add, obviously, you know, the FDI rules across many jurisdictions, if you fail to notify when you're required to, they can impose quite significant sanctions. So be that fines, but criminal sanctions as well. So just to add that, parties should be aware of.
And presumably also potentially termination or rescission of the transaction itself.
Exactly.
Okay. Question then, which I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you actually done any work around this so far? Because it came into effect at the beginning of last year, I believe, February 21, I think. And what work have you actually done in relation to M&A transactions as a team, in relation to stuff that the firm has done?
Well, we've seen a number of filings since the 4th of January, which is when the regime came into effect. Obviously, the regime was announced in November 2020, so we've had a long kind of period to prepare for this, if you like. And during that interim period where the regime had been announced but wasn't yet in effect, it was very clear that the regime, once it did come into effect, would have retrospective applications. So for transactions that concluded before the 4th of January, we were engaging with BEIS on a more informal basis, trying to gauge their level of interest and even putting in informal filings on the basis that the regime was not yet in operation. Since the 4th of January, we have been engaging with BEIS far more regularly. We have not perhaps seen the massive uptick in the number of transactions that we are referring and formally filing with BEIS, but certainly these are on the rise and we have been making a few of them. So in short, to answer your question, it is something that we are increasingly having to deal with, and it's a trend we see set to continue and increase as opposed to the reverse.
Thank you. I do want to just once again reiterate, if people have Q&A, please do feel free to ask. I've got plenty of things I could talk about, but I'd like to open it up to everybody because I think there are some fascinating areas here. Sue, in relation to you know, the last 2 or 3 years generally, it's been a pretty tough time. It has been very busy in terms of generally M&A global markets generally. And what with COVID and this increase in regulatory intervention, should we say, or oversight, there have been some interesting things arising. I work a lot in, or I have historically worked a lot in a number of jurisdictions like Myanmar, for example, where it has been, sanctions have been part and parcel of doing any form of M&A transaction, and that analysis needs to be done first and foremost, both by the principals to a deal, but also by anybody advising on those deals as well. I know we have a number of other lawyers as well on this, just thinking about how it works. So in relation to, obviously, the tragedy that's occurring at the moment in the Ukraine, what are you seeing in terms of sanctions? Can you just talk to us a little bit as an introduction about what's going on there actually, and what are we seeing, what are you involved in at present?
Well, I think the starting point is that it's important to appreciate that there's no one global sanctions body. Each jurisdiction has its own sanctions in place. So the main authorities, the main regimes are the US, the EU and the UK. The US has the widest potential reach. Certainly in relation to the Iranian regime, there are primary sanctions aimed at US persons and discouraging them from doing business with Iran. And there are secondary sanctions aimed at non-US persons, again aimed at discouraging them doing business with Iran. But if you're just looking at the EU and UK regimes, you might be happily labouring under the assumption that they only apply in the EU or the UK respectively. Unfortunately, that's not true. They apply to every EU or UK national, wherever they're doing business in the world, and to all entities that are established pursuant to those laws, and to any business conducted in whole or in part within either the EU or UK respectively. Now, what that means is if you are doing a transaction, say you're a UK company acquiring a Singaporean company that has previously been doing business quite legitimately with Russia, you would actually, and it happens to have EU nationals involved, you're going to have to look at the UK, the Singaporean regime to the extent it's applicable, and also the EU regime.
It sounds like something of a lawyer's bonanza, potentially.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's necessary because you can't just read across the various regimes. They all have subtle differences. What might be permitted in the UK will not be permitted in the EU. And though we've seen, actually, what I think is interesting is a sort of realignment between the US and the EU, potentially leaving the UK out in the cold a little bit. Because when you're looking at designated persons and asset freezing measures, obviously you need to look at the issue of ownership and control of underlying companies and assets. The UK has put out some very firm guidance that if a company is owned by 2 designated persons, you do not aggregate those shareholdings to determine whether the company should be subject to an asset freeze. But the US and the EU have put out very firm guidance that that's exactly what you would do. You do aggregate.
Right.
And so say, for example, you've got 2 designated persons who have shareholdings of, say, 25 and 26%. Under the UK regime, you wouldn't freeze that company. Under the EU and US regime, you would.
Right. That's complicated.
Yeah.
And so when working on, let's say, an OFAC-related Washington-based sanctions arrangement, how do we get around that issue, and how do we look at that in combination with colleagues in the States, for example? Because clearly those are two very different pieces of advice, and how does that then get formed into the wider analysis on whether the deal is something which is sanctionable or will fall foul of sanctions?
You work very closely with your preferred local lawyer. You know, we work with a number of law firms in Washington, and you know, the fact of the matter is, because OFAC carries a big stick and is big on enforcement, the reality is you're much more likely to follow the US rules than anybody else's.
Right, okay. And of course, the other thing that obviously is very relevant here is that Washington does change its perspectives quite regularly. So they are regularly putting out new notifications and redesignating or making new designations on different jurisdictions and entities generally. In terms of Russia and the Ukrainian situation particularly, is there anything different about the way in which either governments, the regulatory bodies, or others are sort of implementing and enforcing?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, there's the speed at which they've been imposed. With the regimes targeting Iran, it took over 5 years to get to the level of sanctions that we're now looking at with Russia. It's taken less than 8 weeks.
Yes.
Interestingly, I think actually the EU have been the most active, more so than the US. I mean, secondly, it's their complexity. Because they've been written in a hurry, there's, you know, heaps of mistakes. And again, the EU in particular have been replacing wording as and when defects in the original wording have been found. And they're very active in putting out guidance, actually. Third, they're changing constantly. The UK has pre-announced lots of sanctions, some of which we've not even seen the detail of, sort of 3 to 4 weeks on. We're still waiting the wording of the apparent ban on investments in Russia. Mm-hmm. And there was a ban announced by Liz Truss a week ago, I think, on services and service exports to Russia. But again, we've not seen any of the detail. Fourthly, it's the willingness of the individual competent authorities in the EU member states to issue their own guidance, in addition to that issued by the European Commission. So the European Commission guidance is binding and you can rely on it. You can't rely on the guidance which is issued by the individual member states. But what has been really interesting is Cyprus, for example, has put out guidance about a prohibition on providing trustee services to Russian high net worth individuals, in which they attempted to argue that it only applied to new trusts. I mean, that's a complete and utter nonsense, and it does huge violence to the sanctions wording. Right. But you know, it's evidence of a sort of protectionism around individual industries, which are important to the member states. But on the other hand, the other thing that has been really, really quite eye-opening is the willingness of the individual competent authorities, including the EU and the UK, to liaise with one another to put out similar guidance. So I have seen, for example, in respect of an application for a license which was put into, I'm going to say, they all confirmed in almost identical wording that a license was not required because, notwithstanding the company was owned by a designated person, they were not confident that he actually controlled it. And in those circumstances, no license was required. That's new. Previously, what I would have seen is just, you know, you'd put something into OFSI and it would just be ignored.
Okay, that's interesting. It does show the sort of the divergence of opinions and the way in which these are being enforced. It's fascinating. So in terms of actually when you're seeing involved in sort of M&A workarounds at the moment. Is it a bit too early in terms of looking at how the Russia piece is working out actually, or are we seeing examples of
Yeah, it is. It's too early. I mean, what we're really seeing is, Western companies seeking to extricate themselves from deals in Russia rather than investigating the possibilities around what might be permitted.
And we all see these classic termination rights and force majeure rights, for example, around sanctions, for example. Are these actually holding up the usual standard wording that one sees? Now, I know that there's different wordings for different things, but what we've previously all thought about in connection with sort of force majeure and termination around sanctions, is it working? Because I know that, for example, in Myanmar, when we've had issues around this before, it's difficult. It's difficult to enforce the termination.
I think that remains the case. There's lots of very sophisticated sanctions clauses that are put in place in contracts. Shockingly, the one that I've most recently been advising on had no force majeure clause and no relevant sanctions clause.
Right. Okay. Point noted. And again, there you go. That's a good example of why you need to get people who know what they're doing when talking about these things. Actually, so it reminds me, it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago that you were in Singapore last, I think, in relation to these sorts of issues previously. Obviously, the Russia-Ukraine situation hadn't kicked off like it is now, but we were having very similar sorts of conversations back then when we did a large presentation to a big number of people on similar sorts of issues. So I look forward to seeing you out here in Singapore again in due course to talk similarly. Now, thanks a lot, Sue. Wanting to just move back onto a more particular issue which has arisen and is coming up time and again in relation to doing M&A, particularly in the UK, but also to a degree in the EU as well. And actually, I've just come back with a couple of my partners in the corporate team, M&A team at Stephenson Harwood, from a long trip to the US, where one of the key areas that we were talking about as a sort of key trend in UK M&A is the rise in the power and enforcement opportunities for the pensions regulator in the UK. Chris, could you tell us a little bit about what this issue is, why it comes up and how it's been affected, and why it affects us, thinking about it from both a domestic UK transaction, but also overseas and cross-border too as well, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I guess the in short point is that it's now, if it was always the case, but I suppose it's very much the case now, that whenever M&A is being conducted or being planned, businesses do need to consider the impact of that action on a defined benefit pension scheme, which could be affected, and mitigate that impact, because the regulator has powers to impose sanctions if you don't. The regulator used to have, has had these powers since 2004, but has always been slow to use them. But there's been, in the wake of some high-profile business collapses and M&A activity, so BHS, Arcadia, Toys R Us, Carillion, British Steel, the number of select committees, of course, that have just been attacking the regulator, saying, why didn't you act faster? Why didn't you do anything about this? With the need for pension schemes to rely on the lifeboat, the Pension Protection Fund, which is funded by other pension schemes, and therefore the industry was saying that perhaps more needs to be done, or the regulator needs to act faster. So TPRs, or the regulator's powers, have been strengthened significantly and are now easier to use. So this is the new Pension Schemes Act 2021. It's really very recently come into full power. So it's no surprise if people hadn't necessarily picked up on it. But it's to say that some directors and advisors, even when you speak to them now, they say that they think the corporate veil will protect them with M&A activities. As long as they structure things, then they can pay dividends out and they can divest assets out of groups with an undefended pension scheme without any concern. That was incorrect before, but that's very much incorrect now, in the fact that these new powers can be a massive fetter on contractual rights and debt obligations that you're writing into contracts, because the regulator has the power to effectively go around those. And these new powers are sanctions, such as criminal sanctions, so they can impose a 7-year sentence for an unlimited fine, and it's not specific as to who that is. It's assumed to people like directors of companies that have acted inappropriately, but it could be on advisors, it could be on various people. There's civil powers to impose debts, to provide support to schemes. New triggers are now easier to pass. and the regulator can investigate, compel disclosure, and interview individuals under caution. Now, the regulators never had criminal sanction powers before. And it's always said that these new powers are only ever going to be really a deterrent. It's going to be unlikely that they're going to use them. But when these powers were coming through in consultation, they referred to the Philip Greens of this world, is how they were referring to it, almost implying that if they had the power, they would have put him in prison, which is an interesting statement about how they see these activities. And if these powers sound like parliamentary overreach, going too far or interference with rescue culture and normal M&A activity, I'd say you're not alone. Many have said this, and there have been responses to consultations, and TPR has said, if you do nothing wrong, then you have nothing to fear. So what's the problem? Which is not a very encouraging statement for a regulator ever really to make. But also the statements they've been making are saying things like, we would intervene where there's a sale of an employer without replacing the existing parental guarantee over the employer's debt, purchasing an employer and extraction of value before a company enters insolvency, moving assets out of an employer, resulting in weakening of support for the scheme. All of these steps, which happen a lot in M&A, it's quite common for people made to send a notification to the trustees and to say, FYI, we're doing this, we'll pick it up at the next valuation. That's not anymore going to be enough, if it ever was enough. The regulator is very clear about that and says that it will investigate and it will impose sanctions.
Very interesting. Thank you. One of the things that we didn't raise at the beginning of the session was actually that there's been a clear trend as well towards overseas buyers coming into the UK generally. And obviously this has a knock-on effect on exactly what we've been talking about, particularly with Marta and Will. But a big trend from the Financial Times identified only a month or so ago was the number of big UK acquisitions that are going in, and the small ones as well. The UK is in many ways opening up quite significantly, more than it had been in the last 5 years. But is that, however, something to put off, let's say, a Singaporean buyer? Is that something, the new TPR, is this something to put somebody off? How do we get around it in a legal way? And does it also have an issue otherwise than just in the UK? Are other regulators doing the same sorts of things?
Yeah, so I would say that these powers, and as I guess as the short point in terms of do overseas businesses need to care? And the answer is effectively yes. The powers that are specifically designed to allow the regulator to go after individuals, entities that didn't have a strict legal link to these pension schemes.
Right.
You did only be associated or connected to the sponsor, and you're in the regulator's sights. In fact, for the purposes of kind of criminal sanctions, so for the worst activities, you don't need to be associated, connected at all. The regulator still can impose sanctions. TPR regulator successfully cooperated with the police in Spain to obtain a supposed pension fraud director under a European arrest warrant. They're cooperating with other regulators to arrange reciprocal arrangements in order to compel disclosure and to require people to attend in the UK for interview. And these steps are being seen to be the first of many. The regulator also has just featured as a recent case, Private Equity House, which bought the now insolvent Silent Night debt with Clydesdale Bank. And the Equity House, HIG, planned to push Silent Night into administration by restricting its credit, pushing the scheme into the PPF, and then HIG could acquire the business in pre-pack without the pension scheme. And the regulator pursued HIG and the individual executives and directors with debts of 96 million. They settled in the end for 35 million. And it seems very clear from all of the disclosure and how the case played out. HIG had the entire UK regulatory regime took HIG completely by surprise that this was actually a thing, and also that they would need to care about it at all. So I suppose that one of the first steps when it comes to being aware and how to deal with these powers is be aware of them as a starting point, that they are there. They might seem draconian, they might seem parliamentary overreach, but they do exist now. And the best way for us to advise as to how exactly they operated is that regulator has very wide powers and it has very vague guidance about it, but it does publish these cases to say this is how we've gone after these are the scalps that we've obtained. So therefore, we use these to advise clients to say this is what was treated by a regulator in other cases as appropriate mitigation. If you put that in place for your pension scheme, then you are okay. Because if you've taken one asset away, you need something else to keep the same support for the scheme, or something else to maintain the support for the scheme, so it doesn't end up being underfunded by a step that you are taking. So as long as you are considering the pension scheme and you are talking to the trustees to say what is the appropriate compensation or the additional support that you're going to need when we move this asset out, when we move this guarantee away, then that is going to be okay. What I would say though, that the regulators also said that it defines as a potential offence creating what it's called a misleading paper trail, i.e. saying that you've given consideration to the pension scheme and not having done that at all, and your company assist in preparing a misleading paper trail could also be a risk of criminal sanctions, which is not, I mean, that raised a lot of eyebrows for advisors in the market as well, just thinking, well, I just assumed I'd put some text into the company minutes and I'd be fine. But unfortunately, the regulator has said that that's not going to be enough.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Chris, you've got a very good article on this that I've read. It has been circulated around the firm and clients previously. If anybody is interested in getting hold of that article, please do feel free to write into any of us, or also to the people who sent you the invitation for today's event, because we'd be delighted to do that. The same goes obviously for each of the areas that we're talking about. We've got a lot of internal and external know-how, which we'd be happy to share with you. Now, Chris, just quickly, the last question I'd say is just looking at that then. What role do you have when I come to you with a deal and say, right, we've got a deal that we need to get done, by yesterday, and the deal is going ahead? How do we get you involved immediately? We've got a number of lawyers here who are in-house GC and in-house counsel. How do I raise it that this is an issue to raise, that it is something to be relevant to for people from overseas coming into the UK and other parts of the world? What level of diligence will they need to do? Is it a sort of a little bit like Marcia and Will, a bit of a desktop analysis up front, but then have to obviously dive really deep down into it if obvious issues come up? Well, how does it play out?
So as is always the way with these things, it's a lot easier to sort the issue out in advance than trying to sort it out later. So as the disputes law, a lot of the time I deal with a case where the regulator's starting to intervene. You have a client comes to you saying, we're a bit concerned, regulators intervening, maybe we didn't do the right thing. Right. It's a lot harder to put a gloss on things later, to say, oh, well, we did that, that's what we were considering. The important thing is to look overall in the round at what exactly is being proposed, and to think what is going to be the impact on the scheme of what you're doing. Have you notified the regulator in the past? Because the regulator does expect frequent notifications along the way, and even just a decision in principle of a company to relinquish control of an employer is now something you have to tell the regulator about. If you offer to acquire control of an employer, a decision in principle to sell 25% of the business of an employer is notifiable. If you haven't notified those things before an M&A transaction, then the regulator has already said that it'll take that into account for investigation later. So you want to make sure right at the start that you're up to date with your notifications. What have you told the trustees? Have you told the regulator? And what is then the reaction? Because if the trustees have said, this is a litany of, this is a long history of things that we haven't been funding this pension scheme properly, this is the worst of many, etc., then you've got to think that's going to be an aggressive trustee against you. So you need to try and make some effort to improve that relationship, or think about that relationship in advance. So it's thinking about who are the players in a transaction in advance, and making sure that everybody is up to date. And of course, a lot of businesses do hate the idea of providing this amount of information about themselves to trustees. But the problem is that the regulator has largely said, well, you can just get better confidentiality arrangements with trustees. It is just required of you now. So it's been old hat for employers to say, I don't want to provide this information. I don't want to be providing all this stuff. So unfortunately, that is very much, we're going to be one of the first things I'll be saying is get your information together, get your notifications together.
And you have a sort of relatively standardized set of questions, no doubt, to pose at the relevant time, but as soon as you can.
Absolutely.
Very good. Thank you. And again, just to remind you that there are Q&A, we have time. We've got another 10 minutes or so to pose questions, but I didn't want to leave today's session without turning to William William has joined us relatively recently and looks specifically at financial services regulatory, both in the UK and Europe, and particularly, obviously, what's been happening recently with the FCA in the UK. Has also taken quite an interest in areas outside the UK, particularly in relation to the Royal Commission in Australia of late, and also obviously in Singapore with the MAS. And so regularly talks with our offices in jurisdictions like that, where we're able to talk about it. William, from your perspective, just for information, there are a number of people on the call today who are in financial services, both as GC and counsel, but also on the business side, just looking down some of the names of people I can see. Is there anything that you'd like to say? And I'm sorry that you're the last, you've been waiting for a long time with your very smart headphones on, but is there anything that at the outset you'd like to say about increased regulation on financial services, and perhaps tell us a little bit about what you've been up to? And I suppose also it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about the work that Philip Clark also does in Dubai in our office down there.
Absolutely. I mean, what I've seen over the last decade is a real pans out on mergers and acquisitions involving regulated financial services providers as the target. When I began my career as a regulatory lawyer, we were worrying about two things. One of those was due diligence on the business, past and present. Does it tick the boxes under the current rules? And to the extent that it did business back when the rules were a bit more lightweight, did it tick the relevant boxes at the time? That was relatively easy. Then the other piece was applying for change in control consent from the relevant regulator or regulators. There were some complications to that, arguments about how private equity structures got treated under various control regimes with a sort of typical curate's egg, where different people within regulators and different lawyers took different views. But broadly, the process was predictable. The only real spanner in the works I can remember coming up is when large financial services groups had poorly integrated previous acquisitions, and regulators got uneasy as to whether they could really pull off the latest acquisition safely and manage it. So not actually a terribly expensive process to get your regulatory lawyers involved. Now, in the UK, that began changing in about 2012, 2013 with something called the Retail Distribution Review. Sounds like quite a sort of technical piece of legislation. It is. It was all about IFAs and the sorts of commission they received, having put their customers into certain investments for the long run. But it was the beginning, if you like, of a broader tidal wave, shifting from regulators saying, we trust customers if the firms give them clear disclosures, what the product is, what the commission levels are, what the fees are. We trust customers to make a sensible decision. If you like, the principle of caveat emptor. And what we now have is close to a decade of regulators saying caveat emptor isn't working. They've been getting really sophisticated, looking at customer behaviors, using typical market research methods to see how customers will behave on a particular customer journey from beginning to end. And I think the Hayne Royal Commission in Australia was the most exhaustive piece of work on this. And it just said, customers are getting a raw deal, and it's totally predictable that they're getting a raw deal. Their auto renewals tick on, they don't appreciate where products are poor value, and they don't shop round enough. Also, when they're in a product, it's just too difficult for them to exit, so they don't. I'm speaking quite generically about products here because this goes for mortgages, consumer credit arrangements, all manner of defined contribution pension schemes and investment plans. So what's been happening in the UK is the regulator got wise to this. They began with the Retail Distribution Review and this very narrow issue of IFA Trail Commission, and then they got blindsided by Brexit. So they didn't forget about their findings. They essentially put them down, saw Brexit through, and now they've really returned with a vengeance to finding this malaise everywhere they look for it. They've chipped away at general insurance pricing and for the first time introduced this concept that a product should offer fair value. We don't know what a sensible profit margin looks like for fair value, and this is really the subject of great nervousness. And having chipped away at this issue in the general insurance market, we are now, probably as of 1st January next year, going to have a much broader consumer duty where these concepts are applied across the board. So on an M&A transaction, this means that where historically you've been saying, does the business pass muster at the moment? Is it a bit grey? How do we think the regulator might look at this? We're now actually saying, fundamentally, is this a product that we think in 2 or 3 years can still be provided to customers and to the same customer base through the same sort of distribution channel? Are we going to have to reduce fees or commission levels in some way? And as a point that sort of had the same impact on M&A but comes from a different policy background, what are our internal costs going to be for providing this product?
Mm-hmm.
We've had reams of new prudential legislation. That's legislation about the sorts of regulatory capital, liquid resources that various sorts of financial institutions should hold. That all has a cost attached to it. That's happening across Europe. It's happening in the UK. It's happening, thanks to Basel, frankly, all over the place, albeit in a slightly different form. So rather than a desktop DD exercise now, there is much more looking into the crystal ball, and it's frankly a very difficult exercise.
Right. How very Harry Potter-esque.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. That's a very detailed answer, which takes us up to 5:28, so very close to our cutoff point. I'll ask again if anybody has any questions that they'd like specifically answering. Of course, please don't feel that you have to. And if you have any questions that you think through after the event, over a glass of wine this evening or later on, please feel free to email any of us. I think details are on the invitation that you've received, or feel free to email me and I can pass it on to the relevant expert. In terms of our own team, I don't know if anybody has any particular questions that they would like to answer, talk through, clarify, ask each other, put each other under a bus on a difficult point, or anything else. Glad to say we're all good teammates. We don't do that sort of thing, so that's excellent to see. Look, I think in light of a lack of Q&A, we're at 5:30, so we'll call it a day there. We've had an excellent turnout for today's session. Clearly what we've heard here is that the extraterritorial reach that all regulators and governments are having on aspects of global and domestic M&A transaction is extensive. It's expanding and it's not going away. So bear that in mind. When your lawyers say to you, we need to look at X, Y, and Z up front, it isn't something that's being done to create more paperwork and hassle. It's actually something that is extremely important around the beginnings of any form of transaction. I'd like to thank all of the people today who've been involved in producing today's session, including Natasha and Georgina, who are copied here, and Marilyn Queck as well here in Singapore. Obviously, I'd like to thank all of the experts, Chris, Sue, Marta, Will, and William, and also shout out to all of you who've joined us today as well. This was the second, as I said, of 5 sessions that we're holding. Next Thursday, the 19th of May, there'll be a session looking at M&A in COVID times and looking at the risk associated with COVID and coming out of COVID as well in recent times. There'll be a more legalistic session in terms of avoiding M&A risks and liabilities, and some war stories around that from both our disputes lawyers and draftsmen of our M&A contracts that we work, and that's on the 7th of June. There'll also be a wider session on the 14th of June about conducting distressed M&A, which obviously has been something of a feature as well in recent times. I think all of that information is on the initial invitation that you should have received. Should you like to sign up to them, please do so. We'll look forward to seeing you again. So I think it's 5:31 here in Singapore and about 10:30, I think, in the UK. And goodness knows what time it is all over the rest of the world. But thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you, hearing from you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.